Yeah, so I'll be talking about women scientists at Mount Wilson Observatory in the early years, as in the early 20th century. And as we all know, Mount Wilson Observatory is right behind us here. And I was really thrilled to be invited to give the talk because Silent Sky is about the woman astronomer at Harvard College Observatory. And my research topic is about Mount Wilson Observatory, where I look into the women astronomers there. So this is a picture from a photo album of a woman astronomer named Phoebe Waterman-Haas. And she's actually one of the astronomers featured out in the hallway. And it's titled The Four Friends. And it was taken in 1910 on Mount Wilson at a conference called the International Union for Cooperation in Solar Research. And I was amazed when I came across this photograph because until then I knew about this conference, and this conference is significant to the history of Mount Wilson Observatory because it was the first international conference that brought prominence to Pasadena and Mount Wilson. But there was no mention of women. It was the first time I saw women up there. And if we just transport this 100 years, we change the dress and the hairstyle. This is a very candid photograph of 4 tired participants in a conference. It's hot and dusty. They must have been overloaded with talks and they're taking a break. And these 4 women were computers at Mount Wilson Observatories. So today the word computers conjure up a sleek electronic machines that what we are familiar with. But 100 years ago, late 19th century, early 20th century, computers actually meant humans who computed. Astronomers used mathematical calculations to convert their visual or photographic observations of the sun or other night sky images like the stars into usable information like positions of the star or spectral wavelength, and they needed computation. So as the amount of observations increased, astronomers started hiring persons whose main task was to carry out those computations. And towards the end of the 19th century, men astronomers in Europe, such as the UK, the Royal Greenwich Observatory, or US, the most famous case is Harvard, started hiring women who received training in astronomy to carry out these computations at a lower salary than the men astronomers or assistants. And one of the things the woman did, or most of the women did, is to get calculate the position of these wavelengths in a spectrum. So we all know that we see sunlight, but if we put sunlight through a prism or what's called a grating, which acts as a prism, we get this rainbow. We can separate the white light from red to violet, and it's these lights that we see in a spectrum of a sun or a star. And the position of these wavelengths, so these white lines here, they give us information about the stars. So the woman would spend a lot of time measuring the placement of these wavelengths and how intense they were. So in the US, the people at Harvard were the most famous example. This picture was taken in 1911, and because William Fleming was not there, people conjectured it was taken around maybe late spring or summer of 1911. Okay, so jumping to Mount Wilson Observatory, this is the famous photograph of this International Union for Cooperation in Solar Research. And a photograph of this is also out there. And we know the participants because there is a diagram of all these heads and their names. And in this photograph, this is the most representative photograph of that conference. And there's only 2 women. So they're here. This woman is Mrs. Kapteyn, wife of astronomer Jacobus Kapteyn, Jacobus Kapteyn was a Dutch astronomer, and the 2 would have annual visits to Mount Wilson during the summer. So she was accompanying her husband, and the other woman is Williamina P. Fleming. So she was at Harvard Observatory, and you might have seen the posters out there. And she started out as a housekeeper for Edward Pickering, who is also in this photograph here. And she became the head of the women computers at Harvard. So she was actually there in her own right because she supervised the women, and those women, through their work, devised a system of classifying all the stellar spectra they collected. And Pickering had a very vested interest in this conference, which was he wanted to have the astronomers in the US and Europe adopt the Harvard Convention of classifying stars. So he lobbied hard to do it. And Pickering did all the formal talks. Williamina Fleming did not do any of the talks, but she's the expert who handled the spectra. So she was there as the expert, even though she did not give a talk. And yeah, if we look at the participants list, there's about 86 people who attended. And of there are women participants from Mount Wilson Observatory who are all computers at that time. And I kept wondering, did they actually participate? So this is before I saw P.P.D. Waterman's photo album. Because women computers were considered scientific staff members, and all the scientific staff members of Mount Wilson Observatory were listed here. So was that out of formality? Did they actually go up? Or did they just stay down in the valley in Pasadena and serve tea at social gatherings, which is one of the things they actually did, and is reported in the newspapers. And Phoebe Waterman's photo album really questioned these queries. So instead of wondering, did these women really go up to Mount Wilson to attend the meetings, I could ask, what did the women do at these meetings? And also further strengthen my question to what did women scientists at Mount Wilson Observatory do during the early years, like 1910s and so on. So we see pictures of them taking a break from conferences, and this is also up at Mount Wilson, and they seem to be having a good time as well. So this is Mount Wilson Observatory as we see today, and some of us might have been up there and are very familiar with the observatory grounds. So it was founded officially in December 1904 by George Ellery Hale, astrophysicist, with financial funding from the Carnegie Institution of Washington. So this is Andrew Carnegie visiting Mount Wilson Observatory in 1910. And initially Hale faltered. So he submitted a proposal to the Carnegie Institution. He initially did not get funding, but it went through, and the observatory was formally founded in December 1904. Initially, it was supposed to have only 2 telescopes. So the first telescope there was this SNO horizontal solar telescope, and then there's the 60-inch reflector telescope. So Hale got funding to build these 2 large telescopes. But he and his colleagues made really spectacular research discoveries. And he was able to get funding to build 2 more solar telescopes, the 60-foot tower telescope and the 150-foot tower telescope. And he also managed to persuade regional patrons such as John D. Hooker on how wonderful this Mount Wilson Summit is for astronomical observatory. And he got funding to have an even larger telescope than the 60-inch telescope built. So by 1910, the mirror was being completed. It was not installed up here, but there was a mirror grinding machine set up in the optical laboratories in Pasadena. And when we usually narrate the story of the founding of Mount Wilson Observatory, we start from Chicago. That Hale was the director of Yerkes Observatory, which was part of University of Chicago. He wanted a better place to observe, so he was really trying to get funding from the Carnegie Institution of Washington. And when he didn't initially get it, he still came out to Pasadena in December 1903. And soon he brought Ferdinand Ellerman, one of his closest colleagues at Yerkes, and those 2 took photographs of the sun up at Mount Wilson. And Hale carried those photographs to Washington and New York to convince the Carnegie people that Mount Wilson was a great place to have solar observations carried out, and he succeeded. So he got funding to move the large snow horizontal telescope from Yerkes Observatory to Mount Wilson. And with that funding, he brought Walter Adams and George Ritchie. So Ritchie is in this photograph. Walter Adams came to Yerkes at 1900, so he's not in there. George Ritchie is the optician who designed and built all the mirrors and other optical instruments. Walter Adams was a very promising young astronomer. And they also brought out Francis Pease after a year, who was Ritchie's assistant. So the founding of Mount Wilson is about Hale bringing out the best talents from Yerkes, and these are all men. So there's no woman in this story, but it seems there was no woman in the early years, and then somehow women came in. And indeed, when I was an astrophysicist, I had no idea there were women astronomers or even women employees at Mount Wilson. And it was only later, when I started learning more about the history of Mount Wilson Observatory, digging into the archives, that I realized that there were women, and actually there were women recruits from Yerkes as well. So for the remainder of the time, I will focus on 3 women scientists: Louise Ware, Jenny Bell Lasby, and Phoebe Waterman. So Louise Ware was the first woman scientist employed at Mount Wilson. And this is a photograph taken of the Mount Wilson staff in 1970 in April in front of their observatory in Santa Barbara Street in Pasadena. And this is the only photograph where I can positively identify Louise Ware. She was born in Auburn, New York in 1875, attended Vassar College, graduated in 1900, and at Vassar, she took astronomy courses where she learned to observe with a telescope, as well as reducing the data she observed. After graduating, she taught high school in another upstate city called Batavia, and then was hired at Yerkes as a computer in 1902. And at Yerkes, she worked on positional astronomy, measuring the position of stars. But despite that work, Hale was very anxious to have Ware come out to Pasadena and work for him. And Hale planned his observatory to be an astrophysical observatory. So not just measuring the position of stars, but actually studying the characteristics of the sun and the stars. So as soon as he got the big grant to build the observatory, he immediately made inquiries to see if Ware was interested in coming up to Pasadena. She was, but first she had to finish her work at Yerkes. So she eventually came out in July 1906 and was one of the recruits from Yerkes Observatory. And Hale was willing to wait all that time. So instead of choosing or hiring someone else, he waited until Ware became available. So it shows that Hale was very careful and choosy when he hired computers. So her first work at Mount Wilson was measuring what's called the flocculi. And this was part of a research project to understand how the sun rotated. At that time, we didn't know if the sun rotated like a solid ball, or if the rotation at the pole and the equator was different. So Hale's strategy was to get some features. So this black dot are the sunspots, and flocculi are bright areas surrounding the sunspots. And you take photographs of the flocculi over a number of days or weeks. As the sun rotates, it's going to move. So you forget the position, and over different regions of the sun, and you see how they move over days and weeks, you can eventually get the speed of rotation for these different solar latitudes. So in theory, it is simple, but in practice, it was actually difficult because these flocculi were not fixed features in the sun. They're like fluids. They move, they change their features. So what Ware had to do was to identify the flocculi region for every single photograph she looked at. And she could not go up to Mount Wilson to take photographs herself. Ferdinand Ellerman did all the photograph takings. He took took about 71 photographs for this project, and Ware would measure the position of the flocculi using a different type of telescope called the heliomicrometer. So Hale invented this device at Yerkes, brought it up to Mount Wilson, and refined it more. So she would sit here, and at the one spot there will be the photographic clip that Element took, and the other one will be looking into this solar globe. And it's positioned in such a way that when you superimpose the two images, this fits exactly over here, and you could simply read off the solar latitude and solar longitude. Again, in theory, it was simple. It sounds repetitive, but she had to be sharply aware of what was going on, how to define where the flocculi is, and so forth. And then after that, do the calculations to change those into a rotational speed. So she did all those work. Element took all those photographs. But in the end, Hale got the credit. He features as the only author in scientific publications. And he only mentions Ware's contribution in 2 places. And they are similar to this, as in that Miss Ware undertook the measurement with the heliomicrometer of a sufficient number of hydrogen plates. So that's the only acknowledgement he gives to Louise Ware. So from this, it's apparent that Hale treated Ware as a very talented, accomplished technician, not as a scientific colleague. And through this work, Hale went on to cement his reputation as a solar astrophysicist, whereas we tend to forget that Element and Ware equally contributed to the work. But this was how Hale dealt with his subordinates, and his attitude also changed depending on what work he did. So he wasn't always being a single author and only taking credit. It really depended. And how women computers were treated and what kind of work they could do really depended on the male supervisors. So another person she worked with was solar astrophysicist Charles St. John. And the work she did was measuring the exact position of the solar spectrum. So just as a reminder, they are looking at the sun through something like a prism, but actually a grating. So the sunlight, the white sunlight, is divided into red to violet, and they're looking into a very tiny part. And by the early 20th century, technology was advanced enough that people had to revise the position of these spectral lines to get the information of the sun. They needed a much refined numbers. So Charles St. John and Ware worked on this, and they worked like colleagues. So in the measurements they did, both of them were looking to a spectrograph and read off the lines. And by doing so, they can average out and reduce any errors coming from individual human errors. And when they published the paper, it was a co-authored paper. So in the discussions, it's not St. John being I and saying Miss Ware did so-and-so contribution. It's always we did this, us, and so on. So in this work, it's clear that St. John and Ware were scientific colleagues, and they were on equal footing. And St. John and Ware went on to co-author 3 more papers besides this. But it also tells how limited a woman computer's work could be, because Ware's this work and her other works were pretty technical. And she did not have the freedom to decide what kind of research she wanted to do. So at the same time, St. John went on to do other research, and one of them was using solar observations and testing for proofs of Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. And St. John became very famous for that. So when Einstein visited Mount Wilson Observatory in 1931, St. John was one of the prominent hosts at Mount Wilson, but we don't see any women computers taking pictures or being hosting Einstein as he was touring the observatory. So it really tells the uneven playing field in research between men astronomers and women computers. So on the human side, Ware was very well liked by her colleagues. For computers, social and cultural compatibility were important factors because they spent long working hours in a confined space in an office in Pasadena. So their typical working hours were 8 to noon and 1 to 4:30 on weekdays and 8 to noon on Saturdays. So when they were hiring computers, the head of the computing division had to consider their astronomical abilities, but they also looked for a congenial and companionable person. And once Ware and another computer was away for a few weeks on vacation, and there's a letter written by another person at the observatory saying they miss Ware more than the other person and can't wait until she got back. She stayed at Mount Wilson Observatory as a computer until she retired in 1942. And she was known for her punctuality and high standards in carrying out scientific tasks. She was the 4th longest staff member at Mount Wilson Observatory. And they are all here. So Walter Adams and Harold Babcock were longer. And another woman computer, Cora Burwell, stayed at Mount Wilson a little longer than Ware. But these people all worked at Mount Wilson for over 40 years. And afterwards, she retired and then worked at Caltech as a computer connected with rocket investigations for the Second World War. And we can see her humbleness in a response to a questionnaire sent out by Vassar College in 1950 to the question, give your reason why you would or would not major in the same field. She answered, my course in college opened the way for work, which I have enjoyed, in which I have had a measure of usefulness and in which associations have been pleasant and stimulating to growth. I can't think of any major changes I could have made in choosing my course that would have proved better in view of my own limitations. Yeah, I found it very humbling and that she could say this without showing off how meticulous and precise she could be. So the next woman is Jenny Lasby. She was the 3rd woman scientist hired at Mount Wilson in October 1906, so a few months after Louise Ware. So she was born in Castle Rock, Minnesota, and attended college in a nearby town called Carleton College. Got her bachelor's degree there, and then went east to Mount Holyoke College to get her master's. So there were 4 students in the graduate program, and she was one of them, and the only one doing astronomy. So Jenny Lasby is actually, she has a higher formal education degree than George Ellery Hale, because Hale only had a bachelor's degree from MIT, and Lasby has a master's. And collaborations and assistance can come in many forms. So this is a page from a photo album that's been digitized. It's a photo album of an astronomer named John Plaskett, and it's downloadable at the Huntington Digital Library. So I was looking at this photograph, and there are photos not only in this album, but in other places where I had a hunch who Jenny Lasby would be, but I didn't have 100% affirmative, a smoking gun type evidence. And then my daughter pointed out, oh, there's a penciled label called Miss Lasby. So I looked at it more carefully, and she pointed it out that it's here. If you have a super high definition computer monitor, like a really large high definition monitor, you can actually see it, but with a laptop like this, it's very difficult to see. And it's pointing to this person. So this person is Miss Lasby, and it's taken on the same day because this photograph, the John Casket album, was taken at the same conference, the 1910 International Union for Solar Cooperation, and same as the Phoebe Waterman's album. So she's wearing the same dress, she's holding the same instrument. So I could positively identify, okay, this is Jenny Lasby. And it only led to that, it led to furthermore, I could actually study the social interactions. Because Phoebe Waterman's album had names here. So this is like, looking at here, this is Phoebe Waterman, Jess, Ruth, HB, and Ann. And this is Jenny Bell Lasby. And me and my daughter did some digging around, and this person is not Jess, this person is not Ruth Smith, this person is not HB. So it's very likely they were like calling each other by nicknames. They weren't calling each other Miss Ware or Miss Lasby or Miss Waterman. They were in a much more familiar term socially. So this was a very fun and interesting to look into, like how their life as a computer was like at Mount Wilson in their office. So at Mount Wilson, Lasby worked mostly with Walter Adams. She looked into spectroscopy. So again, that how sunlight or starlight gets spread out into the rainbow colors. And the work they did was also on solar rotation. But unlike Ware, they tried to use Doppler effect on spectrums. So it's exactly the same thing that we are high pitch. We hear high pitch when ambulance is coming towards us. And when the ambulance is going away from us, the pitch gets lower. So what they wanted to find was the sun would rotate. Let's say it's rotating this way. So the sun is coming towards us here and going away from us here. So the wavelength would be slightly shorter here, and because it's higher energy, and wavelengths going away from us would be slightly longer. So they were looking for a very tiny effect. And Adams did all the observations of Mount Wilson with the telescope. It's a series of very complicated observations. He took like spectrograms here, here, here across the solar latitude. And then Adams and Lasby both measured the lines here, looking for differences. But Lasby did most of the measurements. The two used different instruments, and this was a form of double checking, which was very important because this was a new technique. So they would get rid of human error and machine error, and they could reassure the readers, the colleagues, that their method was sound. And Lasby did not feature as co-author. Only Adams was the single author in Astrophysical Journal, but he did something different from Hale. So at the end of the paper, he thanks Professor Hale for the interest and the suggestions. And then he says he also thanks Miss Lasby of the computing division for her most efficient performance of the exacting work involved in the measurement and reduction of the large number of plates. So he goes further and he really does his best to acknowledge the contribution the woman computer did for this work. These are small things, but it does make a difference. And another example is they wrote a cumulative, very large report to the Carnegie Institution of Washington. And the author is Walter S. Adams, assisted by Jenny Lasby. And at this time, the authors can get 10 paper copies from the Carnegie Institution, so Adam got his copy, but he makes a special request to the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington to give 5 copies to Jenny Lasby, and they did send 5 copies. So again, it's not even, but it goes to show that Adams made an extra effort trying to acknowledge Lasby's contribution. And another interesting thing is, about the time this paper was published, Lasby wrote a single author paper on the same topic in another journal called Popular Astronomy. So Popular Astronomy was geared towards amateur astronomers or those who were not really into the astrophysical part of astronomy, more of classical astronomy. And it's no new research, but it's like summarizing the work Adams and Lasby did together. So she summarized a technically very difficult work and made it accessible to a wider audience. And 2 years later, she did the same thing for a work on stars. So I'm conjecturing that she was either encouraged to do it or she was tolerated at the least, because they didn't stop her after one try. And lastly, was also unusual. She did observations as a woman computer at Mount Wilson. So this is the telescope logbook for the 60-inch reflector telescope. And on May 29th, 1912, she's formally written down in the logbook as being observer Adams and Nasby. And her observation is also formally acknowledged and mentioned in the report to the Carnegie Institution. But she's not written as an observer. She's always written as having assisted the observer, and the observer were the men. Between May 1912 and April 1914, she observed 53 nights. So this was not a one-off event. And Walter Adams, was the person who arranged all the telescope time during these years. So it's assumed that she was tolerated at the least, most likely encouraged to observe by Adams as well. So despite the limitation, she must have been quite helpful and proficient in observing with the telescope. But she faced additional practical difficulties when she was up in the mountain, because she couldn't use the dormitories for the astronomers on the observatory grounds because Hale made that place only for men astronomers. There was no place for women to stay. So she most likely stayed at the hotel or in one of the cottages that was dotted around the hotel. And these accommodations were at the center of tourist activities. So it's less convenient for an observer who spent the entire night observing and wants to get some sleep during daytime, and there's all sorts of noise and activities going on. And though women were not formally prohibited, there's no written rule that women were not allowed to observe at Mount Wilson in the first half of the 20th century. But men astronomers, including Adams and other directors and other astronomers, they kept citing this excuse that there's no place for women to stay up there. And they used that excuse to deny women astronomers, including Margaret Burbidge, from observing there until the 1940s. So Nasby was quite unique in that she wrote papers and she observed, but they did not lead to any promotion of a research career in Mount Wilson. So she just remained a computer, the salary remained the same. So in 1914 May, she took a year's leave of absence to do a tour of Europe, which likely meant that she intended to look for a research position or research opportunities in Europe. But her visit was cut short due to the onset of the First World War. She returned to the US. She formally resigned from Mount Wilson in 1915. And during the duration of the war, she was a librarian and researcher at Carleton College in Minnesota. And after the war, she came back to Southern California, and she taught history and astronomy at Santa Ana College in Orange County. And annually, she would bring out her students to Mount Wilson Observatory to look at the 60-inch telescope. So she kept in touch with the astronomers at Mount Wilson. In 1929, she married a fellow scientist named Heinrich Arnold Johannes Tessmann. So she's known as Jenny Lasby Tessmann or Jenny Lasby or Jenny Tessmann. And there's a planetarium in Santa Ana College. It's named after her. The Tessmann Planetarium, this is the photograph of the renovated planetarium. So they do remember her contribution in astronomy education there. So she continued to teach there until she retired in 1946. And the house she lived in Santa Ana is registered as a historic property. So the third woman scientist is Phoebe Waterman. So she's from this photograph. Yeah, and this is her. So she was born in 1882. She attended Vassar College, just like Louise Ware. She graduated and then went back to get her master's degree in 1908. So again, her formal degree is higher than Hale. She taught high school after getting a master's, but she didn't really like teaching. So she applied to become a computer at Mount Wilson and came out to Pasadena. And she had a very active, not only research-wise, but also socially active. And yeah, she's always smiling and doing something. And this is the entire photograph. There's a part of the photograph of her outside in the hallway. So the title here is The Startup in the Bucket. And those of you who have been to Mount Wilson Observatory know that there's an outdoor bucket elevator for the 150-foot solar telescope. So in 1910, it was really a bucket. And yeah, she was brave enough, active enough to go up there. And the amount of freedom the women computers had really depended on the supervisors. And some of Phoebe Waterman's supervisors encouraged her to do independent research alongside computing. Others were micromanagers, and she really felt very restricted. She wanted to be like the men, to observe and to reduce and analyze data, and she could not. So she also she looked for a way out. And unlike Lasky, she had another strategy. She applied for a PhD position and got accepted at UC Berkeley. So she left Mount Wilson Observatory in 1911, headed for UC Berkeley, and students in astronomy at Berkeley could also use the facilities at Lick Observatory on Mount Hamilton, that's near San Jose. And Lick Observatory was the first major big observatory in California. It has a 36-inch refractor telescope. It also has a slightly smaller reflected telescope as well. And Phoebe Waterman and her classmates could use these. And you might notice that she had a woman classmate named Estelle Glancy. So there are logbooks where there's Glancy and Waterman recorded as having observed with the telescope. So she was very happy there. She got her PhD in 2 years. She graduated in 1913. But after graduating, so she didn't really want to teach, and there was practically nothing else she could do in astronomy. But there was an astronomer at Lick who was director of the National Observatory in Argentine National Observatory in Cordoba, Argentina. And Phoebe Waterman persuaded her classmate Esther Glancy to apply for a position there. They got accepted, so they headed down to Argentina in 1913 September. And they were hopeful that they can carry out observations there. But social restrictions were there as well. So women were not allowed to stay in the observatory grounds after sunset. They can't stay there overnight. So one of the strategies they used was get up very early in the morning and use that time until sunrise to carry out some forms of observations and hoping that the sky will be clear. It was very slow, and Waterman got very frustrated, so she quit it after a few months. She married, and afterwards she was interested in astronomy, but she could only contribute in the capacity of an amateur. And just as a side note, Estelle Glancy, her classmate, she eventually quitted astronomy as well. There was nothing else she could do. But she moved to optics, and she started out as a computer, but she showed her brilliance. She was involved in designing lenses. She was able to file her own patent. So she became an established researcher in optics, but she couldn't stay in astronomy. And we can also see an example of, again, how uneven the playing field was between men and women at that time. So one of her classmates was Paul Merrill, and he got a teaching position at U Michigan after graduating, then worked at the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. during the First World War. And then in 1919, he was hired as a staff astronomer at Mount Wilson. He stayed at Mount Wilson for many decades. And the two kept in touch, so he wrote a postcard thanking Phoebe Waterman for her note in 1945 after the war. So those two are brilliant, like everyone there were brilliant students, but the road open to men and open to women were very different. So to conclude, Mount Wilson Observatory has many people. So George Ellery Hale is indeed important. He had the vision and the means to find money to build this observatory. He succeeded. And his male colleagues like Ellerman, Adams, Ritchie, Pease, they are important. They worked really hard to get this observatory set up and do research. However, it does not finish there. They not only needed the support of women computers, but these women were actually their colleagues. If you look at how they work together, sometimes they might be subordinate technicians, sometimes they will be equal colleagues who are sharing the research and discussions. And it's not only Ware, Lasby, and Waterman. So here I only gave examples of three, but we should also be aware that observatory grew and there were many, many people involved. So it's not only prominent astronomers like Hale, Adams, Shapley, or Hubble. It's also like the other people, like everybody who was involved in the research. And I also want to emphasize that the story of these women here is not a heroine narrative. Including the woman makes the picture more complete. I want to emphasize that it's not a case of it's actually the woman who made the discovery, who did all the work, and the man took credit. It's not that narrative. It's more of these men and women work together, and the opportunities available to the woman were very different. The playing field in research in astronomy was very different between men and women. So there is no sweeping conclusions to make other than to state that the playing field in research was uneven. But through the various ways these three women navigated their careers, we can also get a sense of how this playing field was structured in astronomical research during this time. Okay, thank you. I don't even bother to count. He observed regularly. 53 is really little. So every month, the astronomers had a schedule, and they have to take into account the moons. I was always told that women never observed until Margaret Harwood observed in 1924. So when I came across the logbook, I was so amazed. I counted every single time Lasby's name was up there. And 53 is not a big number, but it's significant. It's enough to say that women did observe. I think her bachelor's degree was in astronomy. So most of the computers got their bachelor's degree either mostly in astronomy, sometimes in mathematics. I can't give you a number, like a solid number, because Maria Mitchell Observatory, it was run by a woman, but it's very small. The large observatories were Harvard, Yerkes in Chicago, Lick, Mount Wilson. So Harvard, women did observe. They couldn't use the big telescopes because they were in Arequipa, Peru. But there are records of women computers like Annie Jump Cannon. She does the computing work, but she also observes the variable stars. Yerkes and Lick was different because there was what I call a residential observatory. Everybody lived at the observatory site. So there are records of women, I think even in the 1910s, definitely in the 1920s who observed. And in 1910s, yeah, Glancy and Waterman could observe. And it's also possible because they lived at Lick Observatory. There's nowhere else to stay. But for Mount Wilson, it was different because people lived in Pasadena. And they would only go up to the summit of Mount Wilson to observe. So the women computers all lived in Pasadena. But men astronomers like Pease, Ritchie, Adams, Ellerman, they lived in Pasadena. And then they would go up to Mount Wilson for a week or so to do their observations. And they stayed at the monastery, the dormitory. But for women, you can say, oh, but there's no place for you to stay. But there are records of women that who visited. Women computers will visit the observatory, especially on Sundays, to watch the men observe. But it's difficult for them to stay for a week, like in a hotel, and do their observations, like in good shape. Yeah, she's the only one wearing a tie. Yeah, isn't it interesting? Yeah, that's why the photograph, I'm sorry, is so important to get as much information as possible. And I would really love to get some more positive confirmation of photographs of her to see how she was dressed in other occasions. But yeah, I was also struck by that too. She's the only person wearing a tie amongst the women. To be very honest, I don't have the hotel register where they stayed in 1912. But in 1919, there are records of women as computers or the wife of the astronomer staying at the Mount Wilson Hotel that was up at the summit. And there were also cottages nearby the hotel. But it's clear Lasby stayed up at the summit and she did not go down and she couldn't stay at the dormitory. The only other possibility was John D. Hooker had a cottage right next to the monastery. She might have stayed there instead of the hotel's cottage. There was also this place called Captain Cottage, where Jacobus Captain and his wife stayed during the summer months of visit. So maybe when they were not there, she might have stayed there. Oh, sorry, just to wrap up. So the narrative I was told was, men forbade women from using the telescope, they used that. But last piece at 53 nights really shows that it wasn't such a very tight restriction. There were ways to get around it. Yeah, I'm not sure when it was first used. I know there's a letter written in 1953 by women astronomers who complained that they can't. 1960s. Who complained they can't stay there because it's so noisy. There's no housekeeping done for them. They are afraid that they're going to have an accident because they can't get enough rest. But I'm actually not sure when they were able to stay at Captain Cottage. No. It was, I thought of that too, but it really depended on person to person. Some men would just use their initials, and some women would use their initials, some would use their full name. Well, it's possible, but it's also unlikely because Astrophysical Journal was founded by Hale. So everyone at Mount Wilson and Yerkes Observatory know who's the author and who where is. So maybe they want. So it's not impossible. So I guess it's not a closed case. Who knows? Sorry, I can't say much about it. Oh, the same. They had a dormitory built at Palomar and they named it the monastery. You can. So light pollution-wise, astronomers were complaining since the 20s that for deep sky observing it was not so great. But we also know that Milton Humison, Edwin Hubble's colleague, carried out extremely difficult observations. He had to observe 3 nights in a row, tracking the same object to get what he wanted. But it was still possible. So it's actually very interesting that as Mount Wilson was losing its prominence to Palomar in the 1940s, they started allowing women to observe at Mount Wilson Observatory. And in Palomar, they did eventually allow women, much quicker than they did at Mount Wilson. But they also had a dormitory named the monastery with initially no rooms for women. It's interesting.